Hammer. Well, this is the book that even more so than that. The problem with this book, I think, is I think it's an incredibly powerful and profound book. And the guy is writing, he's an ethics professor at Wesleyan and a philosopher. He's not a theologian. Several times he, in some sense, apologizes for not understanding some of the meaning of what this ministry he's talking about is saying. He also apologizes for not being a historian. They are really taking. This book is unnecessarily complicated in the sense that it begins with 1943, and then it jumps back to 1901, and then it jumps ahead to 1942, and then to 1941, and then it just kind of has odds and ends at different times. And if you read it really carefully, you can place it all together. But I think it's too bad he had history colleagues at Wesleyan. If he had gotten one of those people to kind of lay it out in a linear fashion, then he could have written all his ethical thoughts in it, added to it, and made paragraphs, and made it the same book. But I find myself oftentimes asking, something will come up, and I'll say, well, when did this begin? Because it's happening. And then 150 pages later, I discovered this is when this began. So I'm accustomed as a historian to writing things, not exactly one thing after another, but giving you a kind of chronological sweep. This is the background, this is the beginning, and this leads to this, this leads to this. And he doesn't do that. Nevertheless, it is an extraordinarily powerful book. This is what it's about. There was a little community called Les Chambon in, I guess you call it southeastern France. It's a little bit north of the Provence, but it's southwest of Lyon. That's, the mountainous region of France. We often forget that the Alps, the tallest Mount Blanc is in France. I mean, they're very tall Alps mountains in France. And this is a little tourist village that most of the year was extremely sleepy. And then for about 3 months a year, it'd have a lot of tourists. So the forest there. Hibernated for much of the year and then came alive. And it was populated almost entirely by Huguenots or French Protestants. Now, about 99% of the Christians in France are Catholic. And in my dates here, in 1585, King Henry IV had issued an Edict of Nantes that promised tolerance to Protestants. So Protestants thrived for a while. And then you may remember from, I don't know, Western Civ or something, there's something called the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1695 that did away with that tolerance. And then Protestants were significantly persecuted in France. And they often moved to sort of faraway regions so they can worship as they please. Well, this little village on a high plain in the French Alps had been a Huguenot village for centuries. And the people there alive in, say, 1930 had not themselves suffered persecution. But in their history, in their culture of who they were, they understood what persecution meant. So they were sensitive to persecution. That's a kind of a background. Now, this village comes to the author's attention when, about 1974, he was looking at a book of documents about the Nazi takeover of France. Remember that the French fell over like in a day, and the Nazis took over. But the kind of southeastern angle was given over, in theory, to the French and the Vichy government. Although Marshal Pétain, who was the leader, was very weak, and the Nazis were still quite powerful. But anyway, Les Chambon is in that area of France that was not totally controlled by the Nazis in the 1935 or something. And the minister Andre Trocme, Trocme, the accent over the final E of the E, was born in 1901. He was born of a fairly wealthy family. A traumatic event happened when he was 10 years old. He was extremely close to his mother, and his family were out riding around in their father's big car, without a roof. And the father was kind of driving recklessly and they had a wreck. And the mother was thrown out of the car and was killed. And this was incredibly devastating to young Andre. But he also loved his father very dearly. And so his father, of course, was very distraught and broke his hand, was crying. And the little boy was hugging his father and crying over his dead mother. And that moment emphasized to him the preciousness of life. But it also made him realize that people who cause death have worth too, because he did not reject his father. And this sort of holding in balance, an appreciation for the preciousness of life, but also not being really vengeful, is going to be with him forever. His parents, his family had been quite wealthy. He decides to move a different direction, in some sense, sort of accept a life of poverty and service. He goes to the University of Paris, and then he goes to New York City, the Union Theological Seminary. He's put off by the secularism of the U.S. and but he likes the idea of the social gospel, but he also is very pietistic. So again, he's kind of holding in balance to many ways different ideas. And then he meets there a young Italian woman named Magda, who is not religious, but is very service oriented, extremely service oriented. And they fall in love. They return to Germany, to France, and get married. She's not sure she wants to be a minister's wife because she didn't particularly love poverty. But he said he was going to be a minister. He was going to be poor, and he was going to serve people. So they have several places where they serve. And then in 1934, they moved to this little village, Chambon. Now, Andre Trocme is a very big man, physically large, and he is very energetic. He moves in sort of spurts of violent energy. He said of himself, and others said of himself, that he was like a volcano controlled by God. And he would have huge outbursts of affection and love and hugging, but he also could have huge fits of anger. The anger would go over really quick. People sort of knew he was a passionate person. And he was had an extraordinarily warm personality and smile. And he hugged people, everybody just loved him. And so he takes over this little isolated Protestant community. And he quickly realizes they need to do something to keep their economy. You can't really be successful if your economy only works 3 months a year in the tourist season. So he decides he will try to establish a private school there. Thinking if he had teachers and students and parents visiting and so forth, he would have economy year long. So he develops the school, he starts raising money. Then, of course, the Nazis take over. Now, he quickly becomes aware of the evils of Nazism. He is particularly concerned about what happens to children whose parents are taken away. Children are left abandoned. And the author talks about how to him, there was this very strong idea of the preciousness of children. And he talks about how precious, the word precious, comes from the root word that meant price. So that when a mother says, for example, that her child is precious to her, she means that child is priceless in the sense there's no money that she would accept in exchange for that baby. But he says that priceless can have another meaning. It can have a meaning of something without price. And he contrasts that, he says, with Nazi guards at the prison who would throw a live baby into the furnace because it was cheaper than filming a bullet. So that's one version of Christ. The same way that they would have a mother with a child, hold a child like this. So one bullet could kill them both. So that's a conception of the pricelessness of life. And that is the total opposite of him, because for him, an incredibly powerful idea is the preciousness of life. So he wants to do something. He doesn't know what he can do in this isolated village. And he understands the power of the Nazi regime. But he feels that his life calls him to create in this little town a refuge for Jews, primarily Jewish children. Now it's going to soon be called by the Nazis that Jewish nest in the mountains. But he's going to try to motivate his parishioners to have the same kind of concern for victims of Nazism that he does. Now, I'm taking stuff throughout the book. That's never all in the front. The first chapter of the book begins in 1943. After he had been there they came in 1934. And the school is moving along pretty well. And they have a lot of Jewish refugees, including children. And his closest associate is Dr. Edward Theis, who is a fellow teacher. And he has another teacher named Dekasi. And one time in February 1943, this big black car rolls up to he calls it the presbytery, where the minister lives. Come in and say they're going to arrest Reverend Andre Trotman. He hasn't yet come back in from his visiting people that day. So his wife, Martha, says, just sit in his office, he'll be here after a while. After a while, he comes in, and this works, and she says, so-and-so here to meet you. He walks in, comes out, and says, they're going to arrest me. And so she says, well, I have to get together a little suitcase and clothes and so forth. Just at that moment, a little girl comes in because her family had invited the minister and his wife to dinner. And they knew that he was absent-minded and probably had forgotten. So she had been sent by her parents to remind them, you're supposed to come to our house for dinner tonight. The little girl witnesses his saying he's been arrested. She runs home and tells her parents. In this little close-knit village, just in minutes, everybody knows that the minister has been arrested. So Magda just had dinner cooked. She says, well, the Malas all go ahead and have dinner. So she invites the two Nazi guys and Andre, they sit down. And as he's having dinner, someone knocks on the door and somebody walks in and goes over and hugs him and kisses him, tells him goodbye. Another person comes in and gives him a little bit of food. Another person comes in and gets out a candle. And while the two Nazi officers are sitting there, getting ready to drive him off, they're just overwhelmed with people, the showering of love of this man. They can't understand. They've never seen this in their experience. So after a while, they finished, and there's kind of pile of food and stuff around him. And so they said, we'll have to walk down, we'll pick up, where Edward Theis is. So we'll walk down the street because we have several half tracks over in the square. And as they walk down the street, people come out and line the street as the minister is being walked down the street under the guard of these two Nazis. And then spontaneously, they start singing a mighty push. So they're arrested. They're taken off to an internment camp. They're not very far away. They accuse him of harboring Jews. He doesn't deny that. He won't give any names because he basically doesn't know the names. And the three of them are sent into this camp of about 500 people. And they began preaching and talking about the preciousness of life, singing songs. In about a month, they're having religious services every night in this internment camp. This upsets the prison guards. They didn't want these people to come in and organize the prison. So the three of them get a message to come to the director. They go to the director and he says, okay, we're gonna let you guys go. You just have to sign these two pieces of paper. One says you will respect the martial baton, and also that you will obey the rules of the government. Sign this piece of paper, you're free to go. And Reverend Trotman says, we can't sign this. He said, well, just sign it. No one will care, no one will check up. You just sign the paper and you're out of here. Otherwise, he said, no, we can't sign it. He said, because it says we will obey. And we know that the government is liable to have some message there about turning over Jews and so forth, and we cannot do that. So we will not sign it. And the director almost screams at him, says, are you crazy? I mean, no one's going to check. Just sign the paper and leave, and you can go back to your community. He says, no. 3 days later, they had another message to come to the director's office. Says you're free to go. They said, we're not going to still not going to sign the papers. He says, okay, I've gotten word from the headquarters. You don't have to sign. Just leave. And see, no one ever knew why they changed, what kind of influence they had, why the people in Leon decided to let them go, let they go. They come back to the town. That's chapter 1. You don't know. So then he goes back and he talks about when they first come to the town, they started organizing the school. And he's a very powerful minister. He has a hugely charismatic personality. And there are several Bible verses that are particularly meaningful to him. One is I have it written down here. The Good Samaritan passage. And the Sermon on the Mount. And they particularly like this verse from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus has been asked, how do you keep eternal life? And he said, you shall love your Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And someone says, who's your neighbor? And Jesus answers with the Good Samaritan story. Of course, the Good Samaritan story, your neighbor is not somebody of your own race or ethnicity or town, but it's any person in need. And so these two verses, that the central idea of Christianity was to love God with all your mind, all your soul, and your neighbor as yourself. And your neighbor is not your kinsman or your countryman, but anyone in need. And they combine this with this passage in Deuteronomy, chapter 19. There's a chapter 19, Deuteronomy. God tells the Jews that you're developing a new nation, and you need to set aside some cities of refuge, because there will be people who will have accidentally caused someone's death. And the relatives or the friends of the person who's deceased may want to seek revenge on this person who is innocent of any willful bad act. So you should set up 3 cities of refuge for innocent victims, and maybe set up 3 more. And it also says, you do this, you shall set apart 3 cities, then shall add 3 other cities to these 3, lest innocent blood be shed in the land which the Lord God gives you as inheritance. And the guilt of any bloodshed will be upon you. So you should establish cities of refuge to protect people who are possibly to be victims of evil. You're to protect them. And if you don't protect them, guilt will be on you. And he says, that we know about the 10 Commandments, but that's all about things you shouldn't do. But there are things you should do. You should act kindly. You should form refuges. You should take care of people. And they preach these ideas over and over again, along with the idea of how precious every life is. And that you should be totally nonviolent. Even to save your own life, you should not be violent. You should not kill. You should not serve in the military. This is an myth, of course, that is not taken away to a region. But these ideas, he goes back and shows that in 1940 and 1941, they began to sort of create this refuge city out of this little village. And in some ways, he doesn't say this, but he implies this. He doesn't give the exact date. It's frustrated me because I like the exact date. And sometimes his wife, there's a knock on the door in the parsonage. And she opened the door and there's this skinny little Jewish woman, a little white coat, covered with snow because it's snowing. She's freezing, her feet are wet. And she says, I'm a Jewish refugee. Can you take me in? She says, yes, come in, come in. And she says it's an instant reaction to someone in need. Remember I said that Margaret, one reason she was Andre was attracted to her, but she wanted to serve people. So when she sees a shivering woman in the snow saying, I'm a Jew, I'm fleeing for my life, help me. She doesn't think about theology or ethics or anything else, just of course. You take care of somebody who's in need. She brings her in, and her shoes are completely wet. So she takes her shoes off and put them in the oven so they can dry out. Then she goes out to try to find somebody else in the town who can maybe supply her some shoes. She's gone a long time, when she comes back in, the shoes are burned to pieces. This chapter is called the burned shoes. And she says this then becomes kind of how she operates. If anyone comes to her, comes to the parsonage in need, of course, come in. You don't look up theological, biblical verses. You don't need any kind of rationale. It's your instant response for people in need, because you recognize the preciousness of their life. And this kind of becomes a model. He doesn't say this, but he implies this. This becomes a model of her life. And somehow that there are sermons about the Good Samaritan and love your neighbor and the preciousness of life have so infused the mentality of the Protestant in this little village that the image of Magda doing this to save this shivering little Jewish refugee becomes the model of everybody in that town. So they start opening their doors to Jewish people, primarily the children of Jewish adults who have been taken away in internment camps, and the children are left so sparing. Paul?
How do the children get from wherever their parents?
There is a train that goes to the whole town, and the word seems to spread. He doesn't say that. He doesn't explain how to everywhere know that. Since everybody knows this, why don't the Nazis cut off the train? No. So there's a lot of stuff that are left untold. But anyway, after Magda opens the door to this woman shivering in the snow, that becomes the kind of model of life for every one of the parishioners in his church. And he says, as far as he can tell, not a single person from this little village ever said no to a refugee in need. And no one ever told the authorities. Although the authorities found out about it. Why they don't clamp down is mysterious. Now they realize that in order to get food and to get provisions, you have to have an ID card. Well, obviously, a refugee cannot have an ID card that gives his name or her name and says, I'm a Jewish refugee. So no one, he could never find out, and no one knew. But somehow, somewhere, somebody has got a stamp, and they're producing pieces of paper that are facsimile of real ID cards, in which they could write in an assumed name for every Jewish person who came. And they made care that whoever was making these cards never reveals it. And the people who are getting the cards, like Magda and Reverend Andre Trotnay, never reveal who the card makers are. And the author never finds out, even though he goes there in 1975, 76 for months and interviews, as far as I can tell, every person who was alive in the village in 1944. Then they also realize that they cannot know the real names of these people. Because several times the Nazi person would come to the Reverend Chambon, put a gun in his chest and says, give us the names of the people who are here. He said, I did not know their names. That was the truth. He knew they were there. He knew how many were there. He knew where they were, but he could not give them a list of the names because he didn't keep a list, and he could not tell them the names. And this really frustrated the Nazis because he said they are really good record people. And they can't imagine anybody doing all this kind of stuff without keeping records. So they just assume he's lying, but they don't have the proof. So this happens, he said, Machta's opening the door sometime in the winter of 1940, 1941. Now, sometime a little bit later in 1941, it appears, this is another chapter, 2 or 3 chapters later. Andre realizes he's going to need money. How can this little tiny impoverished village? And he calculates they're going to serve about 5,000 Jewish refugees. About 2,500 of them were children. Those people have to be fed, have to be medical care, have to have clothing. And this is a very impoverished little village that's dependent on the tourist trade. Not much tourist trade in 41, 42. So Andre goes to Marseille and he meets with a man named Burns Chalmers. Burns Chalmers was the head of the American Friends Service Committee in Europe. And the Friends, the Quakers, everybody sort of recognized they were people could serve food and stuff like that. And so Andre meets with him. Andre doesn't quite know what his role is going to be, but he knows he has to be more than just a quiet little village ministry. So he and Burns began talking, and Andre thought maybe he should join the Friends service and kind of, visit people in the prison camps and stuff like that. Burns, they talk it through, and Andre says that Burns convinced him to turn the town into a city of refuge. Burns doesn't remember that way. He remembers that, and then that's the idea of Andre. So they both disagree as to who said what do what. It looks like, in retrospect, according to the author and according to Burns, it was kind of like a Quaker meeting where you're just kind of talking, and the truth emerges. So anyway, when they decided rather than meet in Marseille, they'll meet in Nîmes. If you know Nîmes, they meet in a little cafe right across from the Maison Creek, and they have a number of meetings. And so finally Burns agrees that he will use his influence to have the American Friends Service Committee send money and food if available to Le Chambon so they can support this role of being a city of refuge or a nest of Jews in the midst of Vichy. Now, exactly when this happens and how the money gets there and how it's distributed, forgets as good as none. But sometime by late 1941, maybe 1942, they have organized a system of handling this. They organized what they call houses. There's 7 houses. And these are big houses in which they could hold 10 or 12 or 15 refugees. And these houses are secretly given some funds from this Quaker organization to allow them to buy food and so forth. Again, it's all kind of secret, and it's all happening right under the eyes of the Nazi officials. They don't see it, they don't understand it, they can't believe it, they don't know what to do. They organize these 7 houses, and then they organize a series of they're not really names, kind of like dormitories, sometimes out in the countryside and in farmhouses, where the people who live there, again, without taking minimal funds, keeping everything secret, not sharing ideas, and the people who are running the houses don't know who the other people are running houses. Nor do those who kind of have the boarding houses going on know who the boarding houses other people are. And they're also just individual farmers. who would take in 1 or 2 young people to live with them for weeks or months or a year at a time. Again, no one talks about this. There's a kind of a unspoken code of secrecy. So if a Nazi found one person and put a gun in his head, say, we're gonna shoot you unless you tell us every other house, that person honestly could not tell you every other house. Now, it's not clear how they came upon this idea of how to maintain secret. It's not even clear who came up with the idea of how to distribute those rationing cards and so forth. It's just all vague. And the people, these townspeople, they're not politically oriented. They're not saving these Jewish refugees and the children because they want to hit back at the Nazi government. They're not doing this for the sake of France. They're doing it on the one-to-one basis because they recognize the lives of the refugees are precious because they're people. And they don't even recognize them as Jews or non-Jews. And several times the Nazis will say, "Are you keeping Jews?" And they say, we don't recognize and we don't distinguish Jews from non-Jews. We just help people." Then he goes back and forth, jumping forward, backwards and forwards in time. Sometimes there'd be a raid on one of these houses, and they take off 8 or 10 of the children. He does say after the fact that after Andre Trocmé and his 2 colleagues had been set free from that internment camp, within a few weeks, everybody else in the internment camp was taken away and killed. So they survived.
But you said they would actually come and take some of the children and take them to an internment camp?
No. You mean the Nazis?
Yeah,
No.
okay,
If they could, but they're mainly taking parents,
okay.
leaving the children.
So no, the children stayed safe.
And the children, their parents might have been living in Paris or someplace, and people would somehow get them to this little village. How they got there, we don't know. The train came through every day at 1 o'clock. People get off the train, and people recognize it as not members of the town, and they would be somehow usually come to the parsonage, where they would get some kind of identity card. And then they would be positioned in some house or farm or whatever around. It was all kept so secret. They all kept no records. So it's really hard for him to reconstruct exactly what happened. And even the people who are involved still are hesitant to talk about it.
When you say the Nazis would come and question people, take them away, whatever, are these German nationals or are they French nationals?
Many of them are German nationals, but there are many French policemen who cave into the Nazis. And one of the things they're very aware of is in 1942. This comes up later, even though it happened earlier. The Nazis in Paris had a big raid on the Jewish population of Paris. Even people that lived in Paris for 500 years. And they put 28,000 of them in this huge arena that was a velodrome, a bike racing thing. Any of you seen, read this book or seen this movie called Sarah's Key? Incredibly powerful movie. Anyway, that is a really big scene. Well, and there they take away a lot of parents, just leave the kids there. And so there are a lot of, I guess you'd say, stranded or abandoned Jewish kids around the nation. And so somehow the word gets out. Not sure how that is. But somehow the kids get there. And once they get there, they're just absorbed, taken in. But sometimes they will stay 2 or 3 months and then be moved somewhere else. Later, they begin a process of taking them across the mountains, taking them into Switzerland so they can be free. And even though the French cave into the Nazis very easily, there's a very powerful resistance movement. The resistance movement sometimes is militaristic and so forth, blowing up railroad tracks and whatever. But there are also networks of French men and women who risked their lives to get Jewish refugees, Allied pilots who've been shot down, whatever, to Spain or to Britain. So some of the children are sent by that process to freedom in Switzerland. So by 1943, in early 1942, one day, 3 or 4 buses come to the town. And the Nazis announced they're going to capture all the Jews living in this town and take them away. But they send the word out, collect all the Jews. Those Jews show up. And so they go to house. Now, what those Jews? They say, we don't know Jews, we're not Jews. And they said, don't you have none? They had no list. Finally, they find one man who they believe is Jewish. And although there are a lot of Nazi soldiers walking back and forth, and 3 or 4 buses, they got one man leading that bus. And actually, Andre Trotman's little boy, as long as he's this man up there, hopefully sitting in the bus, hands him a piece of candy. And then the other people in the community begin to come by and hand food through the window to this person who's arrested. After about 2 days sitting in this bus, the Nazis realize that he's only one half Jewish, so he's not Jewish enough to count. So they didn't go. And so they leave, bus is driving away, and they apparently only found one woman. No one knows what happened to her. Was she killed or was she escaped? What? After 3 days of trying to hunt everyone down, they finally leave with one person. This is not 1942. Now this sounds very disconnected the way I'm telling it. That's the way the book tells. But he really tried to get into this idea of what was it that motivated these farmers who were not politically oriented, who were more pietistic than anything else. Why were they willing to risk their lives, risk their farms and everything to save the lives of people that never met before? And he says that really is a miracle. He says, I don't really know, he says, I'm not a theologian. And so I can't really say, I don't know what a miracle is. He says, I cannot really explain why this happened. It seems inexplicable that hundreds of foreign families, not politically engaged, would risk everything, including their own family, to save the lives of people they've never seen. What made them do that? He said, I thought about this. Everybody I've asked this, what do you think? What was the key to this town acting this way? And every person says it was Reverend Andre Trotman. There was something about his charisma, something about his warmth of personality. He just seemed to hug and love everybody. He made everybody understand, again, this phrase over and over again, the preciousness of life. Not just your own child or your own relative or whatever, but the preciousness of all life. And that you have an obligation to do what you can to save people. Now he says, and he has a 1994 introduction to the book. A new introduction. And he said, long after it was published, he said, I kept asking myself, how did this happen? Was it theology? Was it a miracle? He said, I got all the books stuff together, but so said I had a friend on the faculty at Western who was a distinguished mathematician and a cool-headed, circumspect thinker. So I asked him, how did this happen? The answer he gave me stunned me. It was a miracle, he said. He says, now, of course, this was his way of saying that the survival of the village was beyond his comprehension. But miracles also have to do with God's power, or at least with man's belief in that power. His answer reminded me of the fact that the leader of the rescue effort of the village was the Protestant pastor, Andre Trotman, who was a passionately religious person. I could not say with confidence that I believed God had worked that miracle through Trotman, but I had to say in all certainty that Trotman's belief in God was at the living center of the rescue efforts of the village. Says my Western friend's surprising answer reminded me of the spiritual power of Trotman and his parish, and of the importance of that power to the success of those rescue efforts over 4 long years. Somehow their faith was a mighty fortress, as the old prophet hymn goes. And so I have come to believe that if a miracle is a marvelous event involving spiritual power at its vital center, the efficacy and survival of the village were miraculous. Whether God used Trotmé and his fellow villagers as instruments, and whether God protected the village from destruction, I leave up to the theologians. But a belief in God certainly motivated Trotmé and the villagers, and the love the villagers displayed was indeed effective. For me and for others, it was beautiful and beyond all quotidian understanding, like the rainbow after the flood. Now he said that like the rainbow after the flood, because he also says that he was giving a talk later in Minneapolis in a hotel to a group of Jewish fundraisers. And he told his story. And at the end, this very tall, elegant, elderly Jewish woman stood up and says, "Is this town you're talking about, Le Chambon in south of Lyon?" He says, "Yes." He says, "Your town saved the lives of my three children." And then she said, "Can I say one thing else?" Sure. No one would stop her, he said. But she walked up to the front and she said, "The Holocaust was the storm, the wind, the rain, the lightning, the hail. And Le Chambon was the rainbow." And everybody knew that after Noah's flood, waters went away. And Noah's kids went out. God put a bow in the sky. As a covenant, God said that never again would I destroy all flesh. And of course, never again becomes a powerful phrase in the Jewish world. But also, Le Chambon was the rainbow offering promise that all life will not be extinguished ever again. And so that's the closest he comes to trying to figure out how this happened. It was a miracle. It was a symbol. Now he says, look, the background of this village, their Huguenot ancestry, their understanding of being repressed, their understanding of seeking a refuge, their theological understanding of the Good Samaritan, who your neighbor is, their theological sense of Jesus, God so loved mankind that he gave his son's life. That's the image of the precious. But he says, other than that, he says, I find it absolutely incredible. And then he gives numerous examples of people at different times going out of their way, risking their life, save people. And the stories he gives, the comments he gives, and what people say is incredibly moving. It's a really powerful symbol of the power of good. I mean, this book is called "Less Innocent Blood Be Shed," the story of the village of Le Chambon and how goodness happened there. And he says, after all his thought, all his talk, and asking everybody, no one quite understands how it happened. It just did. And the people doing it, they were all amateurs. None of these, he said, amateur in the sense of just doing it on your own, making up your own rules. They didn't have they didn't have secret meetings and say, this is what we're going to do. He did have 13, he organized 13 little groups of little discussion groups. And the leader of each one was called the responsible. These responsible would be responsible for going out to different areas of the countryside and continuing his ideas and so forth. And they became his information. So if he, every once in a while, he'd get a phone call at the parsonage. I would just say, attention, be careful, hang up. And they realized that must be a symbol. Somebody knowing there's going to be a Nazi roundup or raid. And so he would call his 13 responsible, the leaders of 13 discussion classes, and basically say, go into the woods. And they go out, and each one would kind of know a certain region of the area. So they would go to houses and boarding houses and so forth, where they were refugees, let everybody know. So maybe for 2 or 3 days, the leaders would take the children out to the woods to hide in the woods. or hiding in barns or whatever. And then there'd be a Nazi raid, but there'd be no one there. And Nazis never figured out where did they go. We know they're here, but they couldn't find them. And so, but this was again, it was all amateurishly done. No one, there was no one, they never met, they never figured it all out, they never had ground rules, they just somehow knew how to do it. And it worked. Now I realize this is confusing and not very clear. But I have to say the book is written this way. It's an incredibly profound book, an incredibly moving book. But you have to spend a lot of time trying to figure it out if you want to know. So he doesn't do that for you, okay?
But yes, it's reminding me of a quote from Margaret Mead.
Uh-huh.
She said, "Don't ever discount what a small group of people can do. In fact, it's the only people who can." Absolutely.
Well, I just found it just an amazing book. Just an amazing book. Again, I was frustrated because I said, you could have done this so much better. Okay.
Does he have any information in there about what the villagers learned during the period from, say, 33 to 39, so that they would be warned about?
Not a word. A lot of things I kept saying, surely you asked about this. But he didn't, no.
Or didn't write about it?
He didn't write about it. Now, he interviewed a lot of people. Later, the nation of Israel recognizes Reverend Andre Trotman's contribution, and they award him the Medal of Right. They say at the peril of his own life, he saved the lives of hundreds of people. And they planted a tree in that memory yard in Israel. So he is, it's kind of a Schindler's List kind of thing, you know, a person you would hardly expect. But the people doing this are just average. I mean, you ask that, what was your theology? And she said his wife was not even religious. She actually not even, she was contentious with him. For her, it was just, of course you take care of a hungry child. What's the question? Why do you ask what biblical verses motivated me? Do you need biblical verses? He said for her action was simply horizontal, person to person. Trotman was very personal, but also he was very pietistic. He had a very powerful relationship, his understanding of God. So for him, what he did was the basis of a relationship from him to heaven. So he had a kind of vertical axis with his actions. Hers was horizontal. But together they kind of formed a cross. And they were able to work together amazingly well. Okay?
After the war,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of interested in what happened to these people. How did it change the community?
Not a word.
Okay,
And you don't know, he actually in the summer of 43, he gets word, leave. Because the word has been gone out that they're going to take you out. Either they're going to send assassins to come into your home and just mow everybody down, your children and wife, or they're going to kidnap you, and this whole effort will collapse. So leave for a few months, because we said that the Allies are going to invade France real soon. Now it takes a year for them to do that, but he doesn't want to, but he understands that if he lets himself be killed, it would be very disheartening to the whole thing. So against his wishes, he does escape and is missing for about 9 months. Now he's still writing letters and doing things, but he's not in this little village. And then as soon as D-Day, within days of D-Day, he comes back to Le Chambon. And in September, French forces run all the Nazis out, and Le Chambon is liberated in September of 1944. Now, how he responds when he comes back, how people respond to him, there's nothing. We do know that after the war, he kind of feels like, after being involved in this huge effort, he needs something more than just going back to being kind of a sleepy pastor to a little town. So he gets involved in international nonviolent campaigns, international peace campaigns, and becomes a kind of international spokesperson and raises money for the school and so forth. So he has a very active life. dies in 1970, when he's 71, when he's 70 years old. She lives a few years later. But there's not, almost nothing about that. There's nothing, and he does not track down people who are refugees and survived. So as far as I can tell, everybody he interviewed are people in the town who were providing the service. Because the people they were refugees were not from there. When the war gone, they left wherever they were from. And so he doesn't track them down. So I say in some ways, it's kind of an incomplete book. It's a frustrating book. Nevertheless, it is an incredibly powerful book. And I just can't recommend it strongly enough. Okay?
Is the author still alive?
No, he doesn't. He himself had been a World War II artilleryman and had been involved in combat. So so for him, he had seen from his viewpoint that sometimes to end evil, you have to kill people. And here he is dealing with a man who is unbelievably nonviolent, even at the risk of his own life. And so he kind of tried to deal with that. He doesn't know if he could have done that. He doesn't know if he'd lived in this town, he could have been as brave as people were. But that wasn't his background. He is a Jewish, non-Christian, non-religious person. And he says several times, this caused me, I had sometimes difficulty understanding the motivation of this man and of his parishioners, because it's sort of beyond the pale of my existence. But everybody he talked to said that the key to this was the personality and the message of Andre Trotman. So, okay.
One of the parts that I remembered was later the German officer who was the Catholic. He was interviewed about why didn't y'all go mow them down?
Right.
And it was going back to the personality of the pastor.
Yes.
He goes, I'm a Catholic. And
Yeah.
all this made sense to me. And besides, they weren't hurting.
Yeah, they were not
German.
violent. They were not blowing up. Yeah.
And so I kept back to sanctuary cities today.
Yeah.
And other ways, I mean, there are lots of places where there's evil today. What, if you reflect on it, what techniques did Chambon do that others could mimic and let ends?
But I kept thinking of this, I hate to get up on here. But I will. A few weeks ago, there were people who were shot in Cleveland. And the governor said something about, too bad, somebody shot 7 aliens in Cleveland. Remember that?
Yes.
Like he couldn't even call them people. Yeah. Which is kind of a scary thing. I don't know why he couldn't say shot 7 people who were illegal aliens. But anyway,
Okay, just be 7 people, period.
yeah, so that's what you.
We get rid of the
Normal person would say
identity
someone
politics, right?
shot 7 people.
Yeah, just shot 7 people.
But I mean,
Yeah.
that kept coming back. He kept talking about the preciousness of life. Whether they're kin to you, your same race, your same belief, or whatever they've done, preciousness of life. And that to me was an incredibly important concept.
Do you think we can ever get there where we'd stop doing all this identity stuff? I mean, I love what you said about, I don't know if they're Jewish or not. We don't think about it that way,
Yeah,
you know? I mean, can we stop categorizing?
I don't know. I'm kind of pessimistic about the world today.
John, I would tell you, when I was a grade principal 16, I spent a summer in Europe, mostly Germany, and they took us to Dachau.
Yeah.
And in like 8 languages, they have that sign that
Yeah.
says never again.
Yeah.
It was the only sign of hope in
Yeah.
that horrible
Yeah.
place,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think they got it right in Germany in that there are no statues of Nazis. There's no glorification,
Yeah.
but there's those words
Yeah.
never
Yeah.
again.
In addition to in this introduction, we talked about the Jewish ladies saying, like Shema was the rainbow. He had another letter from a girl who was 17. It says, you don't know, because I've been reading stuff about the Holocaust. And I got so depressed. And my parents gave me a copy of the book. And I read your book. I said, but all this in the world. I said, every time I look at your book on my shelf, it's as though it speaks out to me, don't cry. And he said, those two situations. The girl saying, my book feels to me comfort me, says, don't cry. And the idea that Chambon is the rainbow. That's all. He said, that to me sort of summarizes what I hope this book could be and could do. But I strongly recommend it. Okay?
I'm sitting here listening to your story.
Yeah.
Your speech, and that book sounds to me like perfect material for training our Bryce TDK UPI Bible.
Yeah.
Or GPT, I mean. That's coming down whether we want to believe it or not. I think the Chronicle last week had a story. Like some leaders in artificial intelligence worrying about leading to extinction, so. I think you gave us a nice little piece of the foundation today.
Deborah, what should be in there?
It's,
Wait till
we need to.
Oh,
Sadly, we need to
Well,
wrap
I'd
up.
say this, I think this is a flawed book. But I think it is an amazingly powerful book that everybody should read. And I guarantee you, you will never forget portions of this book. So I'm assuming, my book is old, I'm assuming it's still in press. But it is. But go out and get it and
Before it's banned.
before it's fair.
One piece that I appreciate, there were a lot of flawed people
Yes,
that did really good work.
and he makes the point, even though his father, for example, was mistaken and was racing his car, the convertible, and having a wreck and killing his mother. He could not blame his father because he recognized that if you love people and you were opposed to violence, that his preciousness was also important. So you don't go along pointing out evil people and you don't do bad things. Yeah, they're amateurs, they're hobbyists, they make mistakes. They said again, people get caught, people get arrested. Some of those who get killed, got killed because they were kind of dumb. But again, they were amateurs, they weren't trained. Soldiers, whatever you call them. They were just average plain farmers doing what to them seemed the absolutely normal, good thing to do. No matter what.
Wow.
Well, they did one thing right, which is the cell structure that you don't have a general meeting of everybody that's involved. It's
You
all
don't have
very,
a list of people, you don't have organizations.
Right.
Yeah, it was all in a trot made mind.
It's deliberate ignorance.
Yes.
You know.
Okay, thank you all very
Oh,
much.
thank you, John. Thank you.